Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pharmacology with Dr. Sokolow. So, today we are going to start our chapter on the autonomic nervous system, and this is a very, very important chapter. So, it's going to be a lot of drugs, I know that, but really, what you're going to learn here, like all those neurotransmitters and how drugs that blocked or mimic those neurotransmitters are going to help you to understand the respiratory pharmacology and the cardiovascular pharmacology that is going to be covered after the midterm. So really, if you understand this chapter really well, it's really going to help you with the next 4 or 5 weeks after the midterm. So let's get started. Um, So as you know, there are like two divisions of the nervous system. You have the central nervous system with the brain and the spinal cord, and then you have the peripheral nervous system that is composed of the somatic motor system, which is the conscious control of the voluntary muscle, so of the skeletal muscle. And that effector cells are the skeletal muscle cells. And then you have the autonomic nervous system, the one that we cannot control, but that regulate our breathing or heart rate or GI function. And so this autonomic nervous system includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And this is the involuntary control of the visceral functions. So, synapse. I'm sure you know this from your physiology or your pathophysiology class, but in order to understand how the neurotransmitter work, it's good to have like a little review of what a synapse is. So, a synapse is the site of connection between two neurons or between a neuron and an effector cell. So, it can be a neuron and a skeletal muscle cell. So as you can see on the presynaptic ending, you have those synaptic vesicles that are actually the storage of the neurotransmitter. And then on the postsynaptic terminal, you have the neurotransmitter receptor. And so when a synaptic vesicle releases the neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft, those neurotransmitters are going to bind to the receptor on the postsynaptic terminal and induce a signal. So in chemical synapses, the information is transmitted by a chemical. And so we are going to learn what are the neurotransmitters of the somatic neurons and what are the neurotransmitters of the autonomic motor neurons. So as I said, the peripheral nervous system is divided into two systems. You have the autonomic nervous system, the one that is controlling the involuntary control of the visceral function. So that includes the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So remember those two. This is very important. And what are their functions? Regulate the heart, regulate the secretory glands, regulate the smooth muscle cells. So it can be the smooth muscle of the bronchi, the blood vessel, the urogenital, and the GI tract. And then on the other hand, you have the somatic motor system, which is the conscious control of movement, posture. So if you decide to grab something, this is voluntary, and that's your somatic motor system that control, your skeletal muscle. And this is controlled through the neuromuscular junction. And we are going to see each system in detail. Now, what are the functions of the parasympathetic nervous system? This is very important for you to memorize. So you're going to have to compare and contrast the function of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, because this is really the basic for your respiratory pharmacology and your cardiovascular pharmacology. So every time we're going to go back, we're going to learn those new drugs. If you remember this slide, it's going to be easy for you to understand how drugs work on, disease of the respiratory system or disease of the cardiovascular system. So first, the function of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's also called like rest and digest. So everything is slow. That means slowing the heart rate, increasing the gastric secretion because this is rest and digest, emptying the bowel, emptying the bladder, focusing of the near vision, constrict the pupil, and then contracting the bronchial smooth muscle. On the other hand, you have the sympathetic nervous system, or the one that is called the fight or flight. It has three main functions: regulation of the cardiovascular system, regulation of the body temperature, and implementing a fight or flight reaction. So this is increasing the heart rate and the blood pressure, shunting the blood from the viscera to the skeletal muscle, dilating the bronchi to improve the oxygenation, dilating the pupils, and mobilizing the stored energy and provide glucose. So imagine a scary situation. You know what do you feel when you're in a scary situation? So your heart rate starts to increase, you become sweaty, and then things that you may not feel, but you have the dilation of of your respiratory system, and also mobilizing the stored energy in order to provide glucose to your cells so you can keep up with that fight or flight reaction. Now, another thing that is important to know is like the pattern of innervation and the control. So most organs are innervated by both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So SNS and PNS. And in many organs, those two systems are actually having an opposite control. So, for example, in the heart, one is going to increase the heart rate and the other one is going to slow down. So they have an opposite control. They may not be equal. You may have one system that is predominant. So, for example, for the control of blood pressure, this is the sympathetic nervous system that is predominant. While for the GI, it's the parasympathetic nervous system that is predominant because you remember it's called the rest and digest. So both, innervate the GI tract, but one is more prominent, has an increased function on, one or the other organ. So here you see on this figure, this is your heart, and you see that the parasympathetic nervous system slows the heart rate, and the sympathetic nervous system accelerates the heart rate. Remember, fight or flight reaction versus rest and digest slows everything down. Now, in some organs, you have a complementary or cooperative control. So, for example, for the male sexual function, you have the parasympathetic nervous system that regulates the erection, while the sympathetic nervous system controls the ejaculation. So they have a complementary control. And there are few structures under the autonomic control that only receive one division, and that's the case of the blood vessels that are innervated only by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, this is a slide that you really have to know, really well, because again, that's going to help you studying for your respiratory meds, for your cardiovascular med, because if you understand what the cholinergic and the adrenergic system, or the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system do, in a physiological function, then you're going to understand why certain drugs act on either or of those systems to control, the heart rate, or to treat asthma, or to treat some GI condition, or some overbladder, for example, overactive bladder. So let's go first on the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the cholinergic nervous system, because we'll see that the main neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine. So you see that the parasympathetic nervous system, because it's called the rest and digest, you have slow the heartbeat, constrict the bronchi, stimulate the peristalsis and secretion, for the digestion, stimulate the release of the bile, again, to increase the digestion, and then contracts the bladder. And it constricts also the pupils. Now, on the other side, you have the sympathetic nervous system, also known as the adrenergic nervous system, where you see it's just the opposite function. So for the heart, you have acceleration of the heart rate, again, fight or flight reaction, dilate the bronchi, inhibit the peristalsis and secretion, conversion of glycogen to glucose, secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline, because these are the main neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, inhibition of bladder contraction, and then you have dilation of the pupil. Now, another concept that it's important to know is the feedback regulation, and I'm sure you also know this from pathophysiology. What is a feedback regulation or a feedback loop? So it's an effector, a sensor neuron that are connecting to the sensor or to the effector. And it's a procedure that is termed a reflex. So the most important feedback loop in the autonomic nervous system are the baroreceptors and the baroreceptor reflex. So here you see you have the sensor that detects something, send the signal to the brain, and then the brain processes the information and tell the effector cell what to do. So the sensor in that case are the baroreceptors, which sense, for example, a drop in blood pressure. So sensor sends a drop in blood pressure, send a signal to the brain processes the information. And what does the brain tell to the heart and the vessel? It tells to increase the heart rate and vasoconstrict the vessel, so you can bring the blood pressure up and then regulate the blood pressure. No, the autonomic tone is the term that refers to the steady day-to-day influence exerted by the autonomic nervous system on the particular organ system. So if you remember a couple of slides ago, I said, okay, most of the time they are complementary, but one may be more prominent than the other, depending on the organ or the system. And so basically the steady state, so the overall effect is going to be what is called the tone, the autonomic tone. So when an organ is innervated by both divisions of the autonomic nervous system, such as parasympathetic and sympathetic, one division provides most of the basal control. And so that branch of the autonomic nervous system that controls the organ function most of the time is said to provide the predominant tone of the organ. And so that's the case of the parasympathetic nervous system for the GI tract and most of the organ, actually, the lungs, the bladder. Only like the vascular system is the one that is almost exclusively regulated by the sympathetic nervous system, and is the exception to the rule, because I said most of the organs are regulated by the parasympathetic nervous system and provide the predominant tone. And that concludes today's module.